Thank you so much for coming to 5G and what it means. My name is Len Forkas, and my company is called Milestone Communications. We build and own cell phone towers. We're based in Washington, D.C. area. Just to give you a little context about ULI, I've been involved with ULI for almost 20 years. I was the chair of ULI Washington and also chair of the District Council program. I'm a former trustee, and it's really fun to be invited to talk about something that I purposely transitioned my business toward. In prior years, I was a landscape architect, apartment developer, worked for a home builder, did master plan community development, built retail centers, owned office buildings. So I've had a pretty broad real estate career. But in 2000, I got really interested in the cell tower business. And the reason was because I looked at it as if it was effectively vertical real estate. But what convinced me to start a company to build cell towers was a trip I took to Phoenix visiting my brother-in-law, and I noticed at a high school there was one of the light poles that lit the field that was taller than the other light poles, and there were antennas above the lights. And I looked at it and I thought, oh my God, that's a cell tower. And the landscape architect in me thought, that is a really good design solution to conceal the infrastructure, because everyone has a universal hatred for cell towers because they appear as scars in the landscape. And so I started a business to effectively partner with municipalities and school systems and also power companies to build towers on their properties and conceal them in a way where they could be acceptable to the community. And so that's the context of how I got into the wireless business. Fast forward to today, I've got 50 partnerships in 6 states. I've built over 150 towers and lease rooftops, lease infrastructure, water tanks, and so forth. So I come from a real estate background with a technology twist, and so I'm not the expert on 5G, but at least I hope that my goal today is to be able to share with you some of the jargon, some of the trends, some of the things that are happening in the wireless industry, kind of paint the picture for you, and really open it up to questions, because I know that you're all here because you have questions that you want to have answered, whether it's on your assets or on properties or just general where technology is going. But I just want to share with you a couple of pictures of the stuff that I build, because I'm proud of this because of what it looks like. But we've done 50, 60 of these, the light pole replacements. We partner with municipalities and power companies. We like power companies. We like tall transmission structures. We've done a number of those. That's a tree pole tower. You know, some of these tree poles look ridiculous, but we take a lot of pride in designing them in a way that they can be concealed. And this is one of our most recent towers. It's a marquee tower that we built at a park where all the equipment's designed behind a panel, and the panels of the concealment were all based on the use of the park, which is an aquatic center and a nature center. So again, that's my day job. That's what I do. But what I'd like to do is talk to you about generally the world that I live in, which is the wireless communications world. And so 5G, so just to give you a frame of reference on kind of the evolution of wireless networks. When the first phones came out in the late 1980s, they were big and bulky, and it was just effectively analog using voice over an analog network. And back then, you could build a cell tower that would cover 6 to 7 miles of distance, because it was a very low amount of information that was going through. When the second G networks came about, that's when we began to make the transition to texting and to be able to receive some limited information. But again, the 2G networks were primarily making the shift from voice to data. The 3G networks effectively increased the speeds to 2,000 bits per second, and that allowed us to be able to take photographs and send them to social media at reasonable speeds. Not fast enough to replace the speed in our computers, but still mobile enough for us to be able to browse websites and transmit data. And then in 2012, 4G technology was introduced, which has tremendous amount of throughput. It's called LTE. We all know it because we see the commercials for it, and that's effectively where we are today. But so you can kind of see how fast the speeds have been going through time as technologies have been different and shaped. I like this slide because it talks a little bit about some of the the gobbledygook acronyms of all the different forms of wireless. From the first networks were AMPS, 2G was a GSM, and CDMA. So you can see there were different technologies introduced by different companies, and they kind of came to two different paths. There was the path that kind of followed us and led us to LTE through 2G, and then effectively, there have been these transition points where they call, for example, we didn't go from 2 to 3, they went to edge technology, which became 2.5G. So you can see the evolution is constant. There's never a time when the scientists in the wireless world decide after they launch a technology that they stop. They're always improving. They're always continuing to move forward and keep going. But what was interesting was a real pivotal moment occurred when the 4G technology was being developed in 2011 and 2012, because there were two forms of technology that were considered relatively equal, LTE and WiMAX. And as you can see, you don't hear much about WiMAX, and I'll tell you a little bit about what happened to WiMAX. But the engineers, as they started to focus on 5G, decided that they didn't want to make the same mistakes they'd made in the past and have a lot of waste in terms of the design of the technology, the software, and the equipment. So they went to the International Telecommunications Union, worldwide agency. It's actually an agency of the United Nations. 193 member states, 700 members, and they develop standards for all sorts of things that are technology related, whether it's mobile communications or satellite communications, spectrum, internet, data. They are the go-to organization in the globe that makes sure that when satellites get launched, that their signals don't cross as they shoot toward the United States and the rest of the world. And so ITU effectively took the lead to bring in all the engineers of the world together to come up with a standard for 5G. And here's why. For those of you that are old school guys like me, you remember VHS and Beta? Well, VHS and Betamax were very comparable technologies. In fact, Betamax was actually a better technology than VHS. But none of us hear about Betamax. It quickly died. Part of the reason that Betamax died was that Sony felt it was proprietary and wanted to keep the licenses to it, whereas VHS was an open platform. And so they lost billions of dollars by taking that route. Same thing happened in the wireless industry in 2012. The two different versions by two different companies and different engineers threw down and designed these two networks that were relatively equal in terms of their abilities. LTE proved to have a slight and small difference in terms of its usability, and effectively every single wireless carrier in the world, with the exception to several companies, like there was a company that Sprint was a 50% owner in called Clearwire. And Clearwire took the path of WiMAX and became obsolete within 18 to 24 months of deploying. And so the ITU became the organization that would focus on creating a path to developing the software and hardware for the next generation networks, so that there wouldn't be a waste of resources and creating duplicate technologies where you have a winner and a loser. Pretty smart, pretty forward thinking when it comes to the folks in the world that are developing these technologies. The ITU set standards for what they want 5G to, what the result would be, what the outcome would be for 5G. And it really hinges on two basic premises. The first is speed, the speed in which a megabit of data can flow through the wireless network. Their goal was to reduce speed, to increase speed effectively 20-fold, from 1 gigabit per second to 20 gigabits per second. Massive, massive leap in the speed of wireless technology. The second element of the goal of 5G in the ITU was to eliminate latency. Latency is related to speed in many respects, but latency is actually, in some respects, more valuable than speed because of the transaction times. And really it's a delivery mechanism. So there's connection speed, which includes how much data can flow through the network, but how fast it gets there also is significantly influenced by latency. So massive goals here in terms of developing the standards for 5G. The second element is they want this network to be able to be applicable to an increase of devices by 100x. So imagine, how many devices can we think of that are used wirelessly? You know, it's our phones, it's our tablets, it's other devices. But what they're planning for is that this network will have the ability to be able to support 100 times increase in the number of devices that haven't even been thought of yet. And so it all relates to what many of you know is IoT, which is the Internet of Things, where effectively everything that has a power source has a modem that connects to the network. And that could be an infinite number of devices. So the idea was to create the capacity for 100x of what we have today in devices over the next several years. The other element was to create a network that would effectively reduce the amount of energy it takes to power up a device. So their goal was to have a 90% energy reduction. And it's even hard to imagine because I think every one of us knows that if we don't get to a charger today sometime during the meeting, we're going to run out of juice for our wireless phones, our wireless devices. But that's the goal, is to be able to create a network that reduces energy consumption, and also for devices that are in the field. For example, whether it's a wireless device that's connected to a traffic light, they want this network to be able to reduce the energy so that they could have a 10-year battery life in a wireless device that transmits data from a traffic light. Those are the big picture elements of what ITU is establishing for the 5G network. The easiest way to think about this, and I can make this graph available to you, is that we're really looking at, in some areas, between a 10 to 100 times increase in capacity, traffic capacity through the networks, network energy efficiency, the density of data that can flow through networks, the reduction of latency, and effectively spectral efficiency, because all these devices are flowing through licensed spectrum that are purchased by the wireless carriers, and again, to find ways to be able to use the spectrum that they have available in more efficient ways, and effectively increase the user experience by 100 times increase in terms of the user experience. And so to put it in kind of human terms, on a 3G network, you could download a 2-hour movie, a high-def 2-hour movie, and it would take roughly a day. Under 4G, it takes about 6 minutes. Under the standards of 5G, which are being developed now, it would take 3.6 seconds. So it's almost unimaginable on a device that could function that way in a mobile environment. But those are the goals that the ITU is setting, and that's what the engineers of the world are working on right now to developing those standards. So if you kind of look at it in more human terms, you know, the first generation was about voice, the second was about email, the third, I used to say cameras, because that was kind of when our devices became cameras, but really 3G was when we all were able to get access to the internet. And the way I look at 4G is the speed and the quality of the technology and the devices that really completely untether us from the computer. And I think that was, to me, in my mind, the biggest difference. My wife is a very low-tech person. She's got a big, fat iPhone, and I haven't seen her use the computer in our home in about 2 years. Her whole world is that phone. She can gain access to everything that she needs, whether on mobile or at home. And I think that's, to me, was the transformation. What 4G did to us, really gave to us, really, was the complete untethering of needing to be connected. And what 5G is really going to be is the number one benefit that 5G will have is it will be the portal for entertainment. It will be able to send video through the wireless network in the quality and speed that we've never seen before. And that's what's driving the density and the transformation that's occurring right now in the wireless industry. In my mind, the best way to describe it is 5G is fiber to the phone. And if you think about how disruptive that will be, when you think about how we acquire internet in our offices, how we acquire internet in our homes, whether it's through cable companies or Fios or other forms, effectively, this is why AT&T is purchasing Time Warner. AT&T, Verizon, and maybe a Sprint T-Mobile combination, they're all making the transition from voice to broadband to complete experience, entertainment experience. That's where they see their future, is effectively the gatekeeper that provides to you every element of communication from all those things bundled up. So that's in a nutshell what 5G is. When is it coming? So ITU established a calendar, and it actually goes way past 2016, earlier in 2016. It started effectively in 2011 after the 4G standards were adopted. But effectively, they worked with all the engineers throughout the world to begin to start to focus on different modules of problem solving and steps. So it's like any project management responsibility. It's the focus of engineers that are effectively competing against each other to develop the platform and the standards and the software codes for this type of technology. And so where it's leading to right now is a deployment in 2020. Now, you're going to hear a little bit about the race to 5G, and I'll talk a little about that from the context of the wireless carriers and what that means to them. But the ITU is focusing on mobile standards. You'll hear about 5G being deployed by Verizon and by Sprint and by AT&T. But what they're talking about, when they're talking about 5G right now, they're talking about something that's very different than what ITU is working on. They're talking about a technology called fixed wireless, whereas ITU is focusing on mobile wireless. And I'll differentiate that in just a few minutes here. So the race to 5G. So the race to 5G is not about how fast we can deploy a 5G network, because we can't deploy a 5G network because a 5G network has not yet been defined from the mobility standpoint. The other element is wireless carriers have to recoup billions of dollars that they've invested in deploying their 4G network. I mean, this equipment and the antennas and the spectrum that they need to purchase to be able to allow all this data to flow is extraordinarily expensive, takes a tremendous amount of capital. And just like any investment that each of us makes, there's a return on cost, there's a return on investment over time. And so when you hear the conversation about the race to 5G, what's really being talked about is the race to design the standards for 5G. The president and members of our federal government are saying we have to win the race to 5G. But what they're really saying is American scientists, they want American scientists to have more of a voice as to what the design of 5G will look like. And right now, the American scientists are not leading the design of 5G. It's being led mostly by Korea, China, and India, with the United States right up there, but those three countries and the engineering brainpower that's focusing on the elements of the design of the 5G mobility network, that's what we're talking about. And there's a lot of fear by people in our government that somehow if other countries have a larger voice or a stronger voice in what 5G looks like, that could somehow be a threat to the United States. I'm not really buying off on that, but I think that's what they're talking about when they say the race to 5G. Because there's not one wireless carrier that is racing to deploy a network that hasn't been designed yet from the standpoint of mobility. But there's a difference between mobile 5G and fixed 5G. So if I can explain to you what fixed 5G is, and it's being developed by each carrier, Verizon, T-Mobile, Sprint, AT&T, they all are deploying what's called, it's effectively called fixed 5G or fixed wireless. And what it is using some of the trials with some of the software that's being developed to increase the speeds on a point-to-point network. So in other words, what fixed 5G is a signal coming from a cell tower or a rooftop or a connected transmitting device to a receiving antenna. And that receiving antenna in the trials right now looks like a small pizza dish or a small square that you would mount in a building or in a location where you could get fiber from that device to your network, to your Wi-Fi distribution point in your home or to your devices. And what that is that's sending a signal from the tower in line of sight to the antenna. So it requires a relatively line of sight, clear path between those 2 points. Kind of like DirecTV has a path toward the satellites. This is a clear path between that device and the antenna on the cell tower. And they're getting insane speeds through the fixed 5G wireless. And there's no standard for fixed 5G wireless. Each company is developing their own design. There's a technology called beam forming, which allows for the wireless signals to effectively move around objects. So if there's a tree or a building blocking you from the antenna, some parts of that spectrum can beam around that device or that obstruction. And so that's what's interesting. There's also another buzzword you'll hear. It's called millimeter wave spectrum. It's a high band spectrum that's being used to effectively connect devices at super high speed from a receiving antenna, from a transmitting antenna. And so if you hear about T-Mobile or Sprint or Verizon, we've got 5G, we're pushing out 5G, that's what they're talking about. They're not talking about 5G to your phone because the true 5G to your phone hasn't been designed yet. Still a few more years off from that. So this whole idea of race to 5G, think about it in the context of the race to design it versus the race to deploy it, at least at this point. Another way to think about 5G from the perspective of wireless carriers is it's a first-class seat on a 4G airplane. Because the 4G network, just like a coach seat in a plane, it's going to get you there at relatively at the same time, but the experience is going to be very different. And so this is how, when 5G is deployed, the wireless carriers are going to effectively focus on marketing it. It's going to be an upgrade to 4G. 4G has the ability to send effectively fiber-like speed today to your wireless device. They just haven't deployed the infrastructure to be able to facilitate that in a uniform way. But you can get 100 megs to your phone on a wireless device under 4G. And I don't know about you, but at home, I'm paying a lot of money for 50 through a fiber line. 4G has the capacity to go to 100. So 4G has the capacity to give fiber to your phone right now. But again, the infrastructure is not there and the spectrum is not there to be able to do that in a uniform way. That's why the 5G networks will be so valuable. So that's in the context of where the carriers are, what they're thinking about what 5G will be. It'll be an upgrade over a base infrastructure of 4G. And I think another thing that's really relevant to point out is the amount of competition in the wireless space and how it's affected the spending patterns of the infrastructure for these wireless companies. 2 years ago, I've got AT&T. Many of you have AT&T or Verizon. 2 years ago, you had a data plan, and if you went over your data plan, you had to buy more data. Well, Marcelo Clar at Sprint and John Legier at T-Mobile, and it was really Legier that kicked it off, in the summer of 2016, rebranded. They called themselves the Uncarrier, and they effectively took all the limits off of the amount of data, unlimited data. Sprint followed suit quickly, and over the course of between August and January, February of 2017, they stole a significant amount of market share from AT&T and Verizon by going to fixed price unlimited network capacity for the consumer. And finally, in March of last year, both AT&T and Verizon conceded to stop the flow of the hemorrhaging of customers to these other networks and match the unlimited data program. And in doing so, the amount of revenue that those two companies received plummeted to the point now where AT&T and Verizon and Sprint and T-Mobile are really not profitable from 4G. Giving unlimited speeds to every user for each device has significantly constrained their revenue potential. And so they're looking to 5G as the opportunity to be able to get premium pricing on top of your base plan to be able to drive more revenue to pay for this. Because ultimately, the current model that they're under right now, which is unlimited, is just not sustainable for them to be able to continue to make the capital investments that they need to be able to continuously upgrade their network. The recent changes in net neutrality and tax reform were a significant positive for each of these companies. Net neutrality, really, the laws to create net neutrality were passed under the Obama administration, and they were repealed by the most recent administration. But before the Obama administration created the laws that define net neutrality, there was no net neutrality. And for those of you that may not know what net neutrality is, effectively the concept behind net neutrality is that there shouldn't be a preference paid on the speed of data going through the network from different companies. Like, for example, Netflix. Netflix will pay a premium to AT&T and Verizon and Sprint so that when their data flows through their wireless networks, it gets there faster than Amazon Prime, right? And so that was a huge revenue source for these wireless carriers, was the ability to be able to create premium pricing for the speed of data flowing through wireless networks. It was also not just wireless networks, it was through all fiber. And so it created an economic constraint in the wireless industry. So by going back to where we were before the net neutrality laws were put in place, it now creates a revenue opportunity for prioritization. And there's a lot of people that feel very strongly on both sides of that argument as to whether that is equitable to the American consumer. I won't get into that, but all I know is that going back to the model that existed before the net neutrality laws were in place is a significant positive to the wireless industry, which will then provide resources for them to be able to invest in the next generation of their networks. The same thing, obviously, with the tax reform. Huge amount of capital was released as a result of the tax changes that are being placed in effect right now. And again, accelerated depreciation, as well as the ability to be able to utilize that cash that's coming in that was in other places or overseas or whatever. But each of these companies have all had the ability to be able to benefit from just many recent changes that have occurred. The other thing that is interesting when you're looking at it from the perspective of the wireless carriers is what's happening with the companies which we're often related to as FANGs, which are Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. If you take those four companies and you look at their capitalization, their worth, those four companies have an asset value of $3 trillion. Compare that with the telecommunications industry, whether it's cable, fiber, wireless communications. We're talking about huge number of companies. Together, the industry that provides this information to us is 1/3 the size of those four companies. The wireless industry, the data telecommunication industry, cable industry, heavily regulated as to how they operate, what's communicated, their policies toward consumers. Those four companies have almost no regulation. And so what does that mean? Well, the reason I bring it up is because we've got an industry that has a tremendous amount of burden and weight in terms of being able to operate. And I think that the balance is going to start to sway as Congress begins to look at transparency, data privacy, and a whole host of other elements. And we're going to see that that's going to affect those other companies, and we're going to start to see more equality. I think the wireless carriers feel that the amount of regulation that they have to fund and be part of is a huge disparity with respect to other companies that are in the technology space. I do want to talk a little bit about fiber and data centers, because obviously data centers are very focused real estate space. But when I built my first cell tower, it didn't really matter if there was no fiber to the tower, because my customers would put a microwave dish on the tower, and then they would relay high-speed data to the microwave dish and into their radio cabinets, and then have the data function through that. And for many, many years, until 4G, that was a very affordable and economical way to be able to create the interconnectivity for the wireless signals to be transmitted through their network. But the speed of 4G and, of course, 5G means that there has to be fiber to every single tower. And if it's not available, such as in very rural areas, then you're not going to see the same connection speed that you're going to see in more urban areas. So every single tower that I build, we've got to have fiber at that site, or find the path to get the fiber to that site. The second thing that's very interesting is the average distance that an element of data travels from the data center to the wireless NOC to the tower is 500 miles and back. So effectively, the average, this is not the maximum, the average distance a bit of data travels back and forth from its originating source to the consumer is 1,000 miles. And as we know, latency is all about how fast and how long it takes for that data to flow through the pipe. So if you think about it as a stormwater pipe or a plumbing pipe, right, a water pipe, obviously the width of the pipe it creates the amount of capacity or potential speed, but the longer the distance, the slower the latency. And so what we're going to see is a transition from mega data centers to more micro data centers. It's a company where I live near Washington, D.C. called Edge Connects. Their whole business model is to build data centers in higher density areas closer to where the consumers are. So rather than building million square foot data centers or 500,000 square foot data centers, they're building smaller data centers that are much more proximate to where the users are. The company, one of the biggest wireless tower companies in the world, it's one of the second largest tower REITs called Crown Castle. They bought a company called Vapor.io, and Vapor develops effectively a module. It's roughly 20 feet long. It's a shelter building, 20 feet long. It's 8 feet wide, 8 feet high, and it can host mini data centers. The biggest issue they have is expelling the heat from that building, but the notion is that over time we're going to be seeing micro data centers or smaller compact data centers at cell towers or in places where there are antennas being transmitted. So when I use the word cell tower, I'm talking about what's called a base station. That could be a rooftop as well. But over time, to decrease latency and to create a better user experience, we're going to see more infrastructure, more physical on-the-ground infrastructure proximate to wireless infrastructure base stations. So what does it mean for real estate? And it's a tough question to answer because obviously we're at the early stages of even defining what 5G is. But a couple things that come to mind. Again, the ecosystem that allows for all of our wireless devices to function is based on a large number of different forms of transmitting devices. So when I use the word tower, I also call it a macro site. A cell tower, macro site, or in a rooftop installation is typically anywhere between 9 and 15 panels that are connected to radios, that connect to fiber, that run back to the operator's network. The one thing that I've seen in the last 18 years of being in this industry is the amount of equipment that is being placed on rooftops, the amount of equipment that's being placed on my tower. When I built my first tower in 2000, Nextel put 6 antenna panels. Each antenna panel was 6 feet high and about 18 inches wide. And then they had a cabinet at the base of the tower, and that allowed them to be able to launch their 2G network. Today, with the LTE network, we're seeing 15 antenna panels. Many of these antenna panels are 8 feet tall, 2 feet wide, and the radios that used to be in the base cabinet on the ground are now mounted behind the antenna panels. And effectively, they're the size of carry-on suitcases. And they're called remote radio heads. And what that does is by moving the radio from the ground, from the base station on the ground, up to behind the antenna panel, is it gives them a 15 to 20x, 20% increase in the speed. So they lose 20% of the speed by running that fiber and those coax cables down to the ground. So we're seeing a lot more equipment on the tower, a lot more equipment on the rooftop for the macro sites. Just to give you an example, a typical installation for Verizon or AT&T is 4,000 pounds of equipment on one rad center or one space on my tower. I mean, it's like hanging a pickup truck on my tower. That's how much weight and wind load. And so the cost to build towers now has obviously gone up because we need to buy thicker steel, stronger foundations, and so forth. So that's one of the elements of some of the trends, is there's a lot more gear, a lot more equipment to be able to allow the devices and the networks to function. The second form of equipment we're seeing are called small cells. Small cells are effectively micro or mini cell towers from the standpoint of they have antennas and radios built in that allow for the wireless carrier to send their signal through that device. Now, there's another device called distributed antenna systems, or DAS, and just to give you some examples of what this looks like. So, far left, typical macro tower installation with antenna panels, radio heads behind, and then cabling that runs down to the ground. Rooftop installations, very similar. It's effectively a tower on a rooftop. Many real estate owners are very familiar with this. Again, more equipment, more gear, and absolute need for fiber. The third photograph is an example of a small cell where it's combined with a street light. And all the equipment is integrated into the thicker part of the pole. And there's typically 3 panels. And those 3 panels send out signals in each of the 3 azimuths. And then the networking equipment is housed on the base of that particular structure. There's a lot of different types of designs for this being developed, and that is a key element in being able to propagate a stronger signal lower to the ground below the trees. The fourth device is called a distributed antenna system. So the way you think about a distributed antenna system is, it's the other name for it is called neutral host. And what that is, it's a device that has antenna panels inside, but those antenna panels are designed to be able to send a signal from multiple frequencies and multiple carriers. So for example, in that particular device, which is mounted on top of a wooden light pole, a private company like Extenet or Crown Castle or American Tower actually build, pay for, and fund and own that device. And then they lease capacity to companies like Verizon, Sprint, and T-Mobile. So that's called a neutral host distributed antenna system. Many of you have neutral host distributed antenna systems in your buildings. And so the carriers will pay a fee and pay a capital expense to have access to that type of network. But they really prefer not to go on a distributed antenna system. And the reason is because those companies, those third-party companies, manage the network. They manage the hardware, they manage the networking equipment, and they're responsible for allocating capacity. What the wireless carriers want to do is have control over the entire transmitting experience. That's why they're building what are called small cells. And all it takes to light that small cell device up That small cell device also can be mounted in a square panel, on a parapet. It can be mounted on a 20 feet up on the side of a building. It can be mounted on power lines or wooden poles or street traffic lights and so forth. So you're seeing a huge amount of expansion towards small cells because it gives the wireless carrier the ability to be able to control 100% the equipment, the flow at as much or as little capacity as they would like to, as they choose to. To give you some economic, information on this, for example, a wireless carrier that leases space on one of my towers will pay anywhere from $2,000 to $3,000 a month, depending on how much equipment and loading they're putting on my tower. There are similar rents available on rooftops. If any of you manage rooftops for your companies or your portfolio, you'll see that those are generally the rent trends. There's been a lot of pushback on rent recently just because of the fact that these wireless companies are having just a lot of economic stress. But that in a nutshell is the type of installations. Small cells, we're seeing rents from anywhere from $200 to $500 per month. Not a lot of rent, but again, we're seeing that as something that's being deployed and something that's very popular. Inside buildings, neutral host again has been the theme, although we're seeing some small cell installations inside buildings. But the biggest difference that we're seeing inside buildings is that the wireless companies are no longer investing in paying for the infrastructure to provide capacity inside a building. And one of the reasons for that is that it's a very low return on their cost. But second was the invention of effectively mobile over Wi-Fi. So many of us have phones now that allow us to be able to connect to the network using the Wi-Fi network. So the advances in software effectively have facilitated the dead zones in our buildings. If you have Wi-Fi and your phone is connected to the network, so your phone's going to be functional, even if it's in a place where it's not getting a signal from outside. And so I think that's one of the biggest advances that I think are going to limit the ability to be able to fund and pay for DAS systems inside buildings. But we're still going to see them in stadiums and convention centers and other places where you have a tremendous amount of users. I think to wrap it up, if you think about how we perceive technology and how we perceive the adoption of it, the movie iRobot came out in 2004, and their prediction was we'd have driverless cars by 2035. Well, we're going to have driverless cars by 2025. I remember when Minority Report came out, it was the first time we'd ever seen moving files on a tablet or on a device that was a screen, and they predicted that to happen in 2054. So the rapid pace of the upgrades and the changes in technology all require wireless networks, and it's just so interesting to think about what lies ahead in the future. So we'll talk about a little bit about the future before we wrap up and open up for questions. But clearly, big buzz, at least in our industry, is what's going to happen with mobility and cars, fleets, public transportation when the networks are functioning. To give you a perspective on speed, a 4G LTE network in Pittsburgh is operating the driverless car program that they have. I believe it's, I think Google, is doing the driverless car program in Pittsburgh. So if you imagine the speed of the data flowing through a 4G network, the car can respond to a risk at approximately the same speed as the speed of our brains, how fast we make decisions. So it's pretty relatively equal speed. Fast forward when the 5G networks emerge, we're talking 10 times that speed. 10 times the decision-making, processing power to have that vehicle decide what to do. 10 times faster than the way that our minds can process information. That's where the safety really comes into play with 5G. But make no mistake, running driverless cars on a 4G network is a very risky proposition, and we're not going to see the ubiquitousness of that until the 5G networks are well established and further down the road. But if you think about the 5G speeds, 100 times faster, 20 times less the latency, things like machine-to-machine connectivity, remote surgery, drone delivery. I mean, smart cities, the Internet of Things, everything being connected, that effectively is what 5G will mean. I think we're done with a little over time, so I want to thank you all for coming. It was really a pleasure speaking to you.